Hello, my name is Tomáš Hron, and today I'm joined by Graham Griffith, an American journalist, audio producer, and media strategist. Mr. Griffith, thank you so much for joining me.
Dziękuję, Thomas. It's nice to meet you, and I'm happy to speak with you today.
You've dedicated much of your career to radio and audio journalism. What do you believe is the biggest advantage of audio over print or television?
I believe that audio, when done right, is the best visual medium. What I mean by that is that audio elevates quality storytelling like no other. It's harder to make effective audio because you must paint a picture without any images. The reason that is the best visual medium is that the people who work in this craft know how to activate the brain so that we are watching a story, we are seeing people, we are seeing humanity. Again, if done well. If done poorly, audio is background noise. And so that's the beauty of audio, is all of the challenges when in the hands of a good journalist become highly beneficial to the listener and the citizen, because that work is very good at conveying deep meaning.
Many people consider radio an irrelevant medium today. Do you believe that audio itself still has a strong future?
First, I don't think there's a single irrelevant medium. Radio at some point may become a less relevant delivery system for a medium. However, audio will never be an irrelevant medium. Audio is more relevant now than it has been for decades, and is back to the relevance of the 1500s, 1400s, 1300s. So audio, in the terms of how do we tell people, how do we converse with people, it's so critical and will always be there. In terms of eras of technology, first analog and then digital, radio became very important and essential 100 plus years ago. It remains super relevant for most of the citizens of the world, because we often forget, just because of all of our friends have smartphones and high connectivity, we forget how much of the world does not have that, and even people in our own neighborhoods who don't have that. Beyond that, I would say that the ways that radio is done, to me, should be irrelevant, and we should be updating that, because this is not the way that people communicate. And we do a lot in the radio space for journalism that is outdated based upon technological limitations that are no longer limitations. So it's based on muscle memory and habits. Audio will remain highly relevant and hopefully will recover in terms of audio journalism from this moment where a lot of audio is tied to platforms that are also visual. So the nature of podcasting is going through a really tricky period because of YouTube being the number one listening platform. And people who normally would focus on the tools of audio and audio storytelling, who are leaning into the camera as opposed to storytelling for the mind's eye.
You decided to leave daily news production because you saw fundamental problems in the overall news system. What do you think is the biggest failure of traditional US media in the last 20 years?
It is a cluster of problems. One of the things that really affected me in my work in realizing I needed to work outside of stations and networks while still working with people in those stations and networks is that I think the business model was outdated. I think, structurally, these places were set up, and it depends on the country, were set up in ways that where the internal rules were not elevating journalism. So even as journalists were getting paid more and more in developed economies like the US, like the UK, the actual acts of journalism were not being valued as much. And so there are a lot of examples of that. I'll give one to be less abstract. I saw news organizations focusing on volume rather than quality. And so quantity became more important than quality. And this was a misreading of the migration from an analog broadcast system to digital engagement. And that was true probably for print earlier than audio. TV's a tricky one because I think in some ways the move to cable in the US, UK, and other places was not a digital move, except it was a satellite move. In all of these moves, the executives, the leaders, the editors, right down to a lot of the producers, had this idea that we just need to produce more and more and more. And what we saw in that process was lower quality work. And we saw work that wasn't focused on the details and the complication. Because, Tomasz, one of the things that happens when you are working on volume over and quantity over quality is that you're looking for efficiencies and you're looking to get to a story quickly. So we see over the last 20 and 30 years, hypersimplification process rather than a process that helped people understand the details matter, everything is complicated, the nuances are interesting. Journalism, for the most part, steered away from those things. And I think we rightly lost the trust of people around that. So, I'm in a position now, especially in the US, now that I'm back here for at least the next few months, of seeing ways that the political discourse has made journalists the enemy. And there are parts of what we've done that we have to change. And we, in this case, as journalists, we made a lot of mistakes. And I always now have to be careful when I'm critical of journalism as a field that I'm not tapping into a very pernicious, almost Kremlin-esque approach to vilifying journalists and dehumanizing journalists as a path towards making inquiry seem illegitimate. And so we have a lot of work to do. The reason so as you asked, right, that's the biggest problem is just like it's bad math on our part because civic society needs journalism that is unafraid to complicate narratives at a time when people seem to be craving simplified narratives, and the authoritarian approach to the world requires oversimplifying things, which is why racism and dehumanization is at the center of a lot of the conversations that people who are anti-inquiry and anti-journalism are elevating.
You have criticized how traditional media cover climate change, and you call their approach false binary coverage. Where specifically did they fail, and what could they have done differently?
Yes. And I'm going to be careful to use the word we in this case, so it doesn't sound like I'm being critical of something I'm not a part of. So I'll say, what we did is part related to my last answer. We did a couple of things that in the name of efficiency and oversimplification is we believed in this idea that debate is a good way to help people understand the world. The reason that climate crisis, climate change, global warming, the reason that these are all important things for us to look at in terms of the process of journalism and what we got wrong and what we need to correct for is that not only that this is an issue that's affecting everybody everywhere, this is a global issue that does not know borders. Also, it was some of our worst work. And these were not necessarily around factual problems, even though you and your fellow students could go and look at things from the 90s and 80s and do a bit of fact checking and see how many erroneous pieces of quote unquote information were put out there. More broadly, it's in the framing. So we had years and years of climate crisis conversations that were presented as though there were two sides to this issue. And it is a flat earth problem. The world is round. The world is not a coin. There are two sides to a coin. In spheres, there are many elements, and they're not necessarily sides. They're not working against each other. They're working together to build a structure that is the sphere. And by only talking about this through the lens of who's right, who's wrong, This person says this, I need somebody who says the other thing. We let people think that this is a political conversation rather than a community, civic, and global conversation. The disagreements should have been about what should we do about this? What efforts should we take and when? Not, is it a thing? We spent decades wasting people's time with the idea that, oh, this may not be a thing. And so it's a failure that exists throughout journalism. And it exists in particular in the age of broadcast. And I'll tell you this from a producer's point of view and somebody who led daily news shows, it's hard to get those shows out and it's hard to do the work. You know what's easy? Finding two people who do the work for you. Finding somebody who is passionate and says, I believe this is happening, and finding somebody who is passionate to say, I don't believe this is happening, and opening up the microphones and saying, let's talk about it, and pretending you're doing journalism. That was not journalism. That was taking up space and giving people air. And it wasn't as though that was always a waste of time. It's that people thought of climate change the way that they think about, am I going to root for Slavia or am I going to root for Bohemians? Am I going to root for the Yankees or the Red Sox? Am I going to root for this party or that party? And so it's really such a key example. We need to look at climate conversations as an access point for people to test out dis and misinformation because we now know what was known in the 40s. And so we have disinformation effects that have come from oil corporations in the US, and we have what's come from states in the Gulf and Russia. And so we can look at what was being done in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then when media grows in the 80s, this was also a testing ground for disinformation. And we as journalists who are upset with disinformation, we have to recognize that we helped elevate and amplify it, and we were used. And that's the best case. That's being nice to us to say we were used. We were used for that part of the process. So Czech Republic's a perfect example because you have the most robust public media in the region and the safest public media in the region, the most sustainable public media in the region. And even Czech radio is complicit in this problem. You know, I sort of expect it from other markets, but public media in particular should be serving the people more effectively. And again, Czech radio is better than any other place, and yet they're part of this problem too. And I don't have real access to them, not knowing the language. I have not heard of real efforts to deal with this and face the lessons learned from this.
You've spent several months in Bulgaria working for the Center for the Study of Democracy in Sofia. What has been the single most surprising or unexpected thing that you have learned about the Bulgarian media landscape?
For me, it's an ongoing confusion. And it's hard as a human being to recognize the power of confusion. As a journalist, confusion is your friend. It's a clue. And recognizing when you're confused is an invitation for curious individuals to investigate, talk to people. So I'm highly confused about Bulgarian media. There are some things I can say with confidence, which the first is Bulgaria is not a free media market. Wide swaths of that country do not have a healthy information ecosystem. It is a country that is highly susceptible to specifically Kremlin inauthentic information tactics. And then on top of it, it has an internal cycle of dis and misinformation and cynicism building on itself. And Bulgaria is full of some of the most impressive people at figuring out how to get stuff done. It is a country that, for lots of reasons, should not be functional. If a Bulgarian is listening to this, they may say, yeah, and we aren't functional. Yet, coming from an American context, there are ways in which Bulgaria is highly functional despite or in spite of deep-seated corruption, deep-seated cynicism in political parties, and specifically individuals who have their own particular Bulgarian brand of state control and cognitive control. I do not make many Bulgarian friends when I say, I think Bulgaria is the place where we can find solutions to global issues because we have one giant wall in our way there for, more broadly, civic society and real journalism. And yet, if we get over that wall in Bulgaria, change could happen faster than I think any other environment I've been in. Things that will take 10, 15 years in the US to recover in terms of civic society and safety for all people could happen in Bulgaria relatively quickly. So the confusion comes to, how do we do that? And I do not know. Yet we either curl up in the fetal position and give up, or we continue to ask, how might we do that? I learn more from Bulgarians about that than I do any other place I spend time. And I'm not at the moment, I have no optimism for Bulgaria, and I have a lot of hope because that's what drives us. Hope drives us. And I am always willing to invest with people in time and support to try to do things differently and better. I think any successes we have in Bulgaria would be extendable to other places. I'm not sure the world will listen. I don't think the world listened well enough to Bulgarians about the threats to Europe and therefore the world at this point. So I don't, again, not optimistic, Tomas, but I remain hopeful.
I've been speaking with Graham Griffith, a media strategist, journalist, and audio producer. Mr. Griffith, thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
Dziękuję. It's my pleasure, and thank you for your questions.